Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we've discontinued our in-person events and instituted online webinars. Without our previous revenue-generating programs, we now depend on your donations to support these webinars and be able to continue to pay our Mexican staff. You can donate at our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. Today's program is number 44 in this series of webinars that we began last June 1st. Today's program will focus on the problem of industrial agriculture. And we're pleased to have two very interesting speakers. First will be Oscar Ugarte. He's a senior researcher at the Institute of Economic Research of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. He's also the coordinator of the Latin American Economic Observatory. Our second speaker is Ercilia Sahoras, a founding member of the Latin American Director of Regeneration International. She's also director of campaigns for the Organic Consumers Association based here in Mexico. She has more than 15 years of campaigning and organizing experience in low-income communities and rural areas. She serves on several nonprofit boards, including Caminos de Agua in Guanajuato, Mexico. And the Center for Global Justice is especially happy to have Ercilia with us today, to welcome you back. Ercilia, good many years ago, was executive director of the Center for Global Justice. Good to see you again. But let me give the floor first to Oscar and then Ercilia, and after that, we will have question and answer period. Oscar, take it away.
Thank you, Cliff, and good afternoon to everyone. I want to go forward on the arguments I presented last year in October on how the financialization process had distorted the foodstuff market. And I just want to recollect that, first of all, there has always been a commodities market since the 1840s, and some would argue that even before that in Holland, because it was a way of ensuring that you had a buyer for the produce you had in the land. So you were selling your production ahead of time. That was the concept, the original concept. The new concept is that you buy something because it is more profitable than borrowing money, than depositing money in instruments. The cost of borrowing is nothing, it's zero, because interest rates are not 0.25 and inflation is over 2%. So with negative interest rates, large investment banks, hedge funds, borrow money, invest in commodities, push up the prices, and then unload the futures onto someone else. And what you have with that is a distorted price. And what you also have with that is an oversupply of food. Because you're going to have higher prices, and that's going to induce to more production, and there isn't a market for that. On the other hand, what we have established, and I'm going to present to you in brief, is there's a double set of rules of the game. On the one hand, you have price support and agricultural support programs in the US, Europe, and Russia. But these are forbidden everywhere else, with the argument that there cannot be subsidies in the international trade. So what ends up happening is that you have this overproduction in the US, Europe, Russia, and that overproduction then goes as cheap exports abroad. And those cheap exports are below the cost of production in Mexico or anyplace else. So that affects the livelihood of peasants and produces mass migrations. Now, there is something that, just to recall, there is an inverse relationship between interest rates and price of commodities. When interest rates go down, commodities prices go up, and vice versa. So, but in the general trend for food is a downward trend. What you have now is the part of the world that is in blue dedicates itself in a major proportion to food exports. It's Canada, the US, Brazil, Argentina, Europe with the United Kingdom, South Africa, bits of Egypt and neighboring countries. And then what you have on top is Russia and China and Australia. That's basically it. They are basically the world food exporters, and they export essentially rice, wheat, barley, potatoes, and with that, milk and food and beef. And with that, produced in a very large scale, the volumes are huge, the price supports maintain their prices inside their countries, and internationally those prices are low, and we have the consequences we have seen. I will not go, I will just show you the two major price support programs in the US and the EU. I will leave the PowerPoint so that it can be revised by the viewers of the program. But here what you have is basically state assistance to prevent a drop in incomes, in revenues for agricultural producers, which we cannot have in the developing countries because of WTO agreements. And I think that's—
Oscar, do you want to screen share your PowerPoint?
I thought I was screen sharing it. No, I'm not?
Nope.
Oh dear.
No, we don't see it.
Sorry. Can you see it now?
Yes.
I'm sorry. There is the two sets of price support programs and agricultural support programs in the EU and the US, which are not allowed under WTO agreements to be used by anybody else. And that detained the Uruguay round and the Doha round. It's now preventing a Mercosur European Union agreement because it's not fair. No? I mean, if we're going to have this sort of price support, let's have price support. Everybody has the price support, but you cannot have it price support for some, but not for all. On the other hand, the consequence of the financialization of foodstuffs plus price support is a downward trend in prices. As you can see in that red line, the yellow line is the general commodity price index. The red line is the food price index. And the food price index is inverse to interest rates. But once it gets to 2013, it falls. It falls. And now that it's reached down, we are at last year, interest rates were taken down to 0.25 again. it bounced back up. It bounced back up. But when interest rates go back up, those prices are going to go back down. And this takes us to a situation where the peasants cannot compete with cheap international food prices. And the solution to that has been in the past, partially, to put the food in boats and sink the boats. Yeah. I don't know if that's reasonable, or throw the milk down the drain. I don't know if that's reasonable in a world that is starving. On the other hand, the reason for the starvation has to do with prices. So why don't we correct the thing and have people produce at their cost and have price support everywhere? And then we can reduce international trade. Now, why doesn't this happen? It sounds logical. I mean, everybody with the same set of rules of the game, and we can have international trade, equilibrated international trade. But why doesn't it happen? Well, part of the reason why it doesn't happen is because agribusiness in the US, and this is only the US, now we can do this for Europe, and it's very similar, produces $374 billion a year, gross output. It exports half of it, 150. So of course, if it has that kind of oversupply, it's going to sell it to anybody, and it goes out as international aid. It goes as food aid. And Collins and Lappé years ago proved that food aid had caused starvation in Africa. So the problem is well known, but it's there. It continues there. And what's interesting is that only 36% of the farms in the US are family farms. 2/3 of the farms in the US are big business. In fact, Bill Gates owns a whole lot of the land in the US, which is interesting. Who are the actors who are on the other side, who do not want this sort of international rules of the game, even international rules of the game? It's basically, these are the 10 firms. BASF of Germany, which produces fungicides, herbicides, and insecticides. Yara, it's Norwegian, it produces nitrogen chemicals. Syngenta, a Swiss company, which produces seeds and chemical treatment for seeds. It produces herbicides, non-selective herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, and seed care. Nutrien, formerly Agrium and Potash, one of the world's leading producers and suppliers of agricultural nutrients, such as nitrogen, phosphate, potash, and sulfur. Bayer, known for aspirin. It is one of the world's major players in crop science. Bayer bought Monsanto for $60 billion. And that makes it the world's number 4 largest agribusiness. Number 3 is Archer Daniels Midland, with its headquarters in Chicago, 270 plants and 420 crop procurement facilities, which process grains and oilseeds into food and beverages. Nutraceutical, I guess that's pharmaceutical for nutrition, in industrial and animal feed products. Number 2 is Dow DuPont. They merged. Dow Chemicals merged with DuPont, and now they're one firm. They're into seed production and crop protection. And number 1 in the list is Cargill, which is also a family-owned firm. They are into agricultural and food production, and they are responsible for 1/4 of American meat and grain exports. So when we say, why don't we have rules of the game that are of the same rules of the game? Basically because these 10 actors will not allow that to happen. I mean, their business is to sell seeds and to sell fertilizers and fungicides and etc., and they're not going to lose that market. So when we're speaking of organic fertilizers and of organic fungicides and of organic all kinds of organic treatments for the crops, that in terms of international trade for these firms, that's not in their interest. And when we speak about eliminating genetically modified seeds, eliminating them and not importing them, we're facing these 10 who are in that business. They are exporting genetically modified seeds and the treatment for those seeds. So what we have then is an uneven struggle. The power is centered in the north, in the G7 countries. It is centered more in the US than in Europe, but it's centered in the US and Europe. Basically, Japan is not a player here. And they will not let loose and they will not let go to their business for the benefit of the millions of peasants around the world. Their businesses making those peasants their customers and having us eat genetically modified food and use those fertilizers and etc. that we know are so toxic. And the result of this, which is what I find irritating, most irritating, is that we are now in a situation where we're trading water around the world in the form of foodstuffs. So these countries export foodstuffs, and what goes with the foodstuffs? The water. And we need the water for the people. So what are we doing exporting foodstuffs when we can be producing the foodstuffs at home and producing them organically and producing them with a diversification of seeds, locally produced seeds, original seeds. And I see it with potatoes in Peru, and I see it with corn here in Mexico. And the way they have been distorted. Now we're importing corn to eat in Mexico. That's absurd. But that's business, no? And unfortunately, the governments, I find, have not put their foot down, saying, wait, no, we need to have agricultural development. We need to have a stronger peasantry. We need to have our population fed domestically for reasons of food security, which now after this pandemic is clear as day that we need food security. And the other thing is our expanded markets are our neighbors. So yes, maybe for Mexico it is correct, its neighbor is the US, but its other neighbors in the south are also the partners. And that trade can be for the benefit of the peasants, of the farmers, and not only of the larger firms who are now dominating Wall Street and international trade. These 10 firms dominate the largest share of any item in international trade. It's very striking. It's like in the oil industry, you have 7, or you used to have 7, no? Now I think you have 3. But it used to be 7 sisters. But in this business, it's 10. And those 10 define everything. And with that, I leave you all, and I'm waiting for the comments. Thank you very much.
Okay, Arcelia, you're
Thank
on.
you. Thank you. My turn now. Thank you, Oscar. That was a wonderful presentation again. And sometimes it's a little bit, overwhelming when you start thinking about these 10 firms that, as we know, do control the whole market, and why would they want to change their practices, right? And it's overwhelming to think about what we can do, but I do believe that that it is possible. I still have the faith that it can be changed around. One of the things we've been noticing in the past 5 years or so is that in climate change conventions, UN conventions, there's been more and more talk about the role of agriculture and the input of agriculture in terms of their impact on greenhouse gas emissions. So we're witnessing that more and more, and that's a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about this, double-edged sword that this redefinition of agriculture and this idea of companies like, Dow, DuPont, Cargill, they've started talking now more and more about regenerative agriculture. So this is starting to make noise in the regenerative agriculture world. And that's why it's so important sometimes to start thinking again about how do we define regeneration and regenerative agriculture, not just in terms of practices, but also about principles. So there was a report, it was published in March this year. It was in Nature Food. So Nature publication, Nature magazine, has a section that is called Nature Food. And it brings back what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been saying for 2 years now, which is that if you look at the food system, the whole food system, it accounts for up to 37% of the total global greenhouse gas emissions. So in other words, if we look at the food system, that alone is responsible for more than 1/3 of the global anthropogenic gas emissions. This has already been said by other people. GRAIN, which is a small nonprofit, a fantastic international nonprofit, put together a report in 2014 saying that even 1/3 is too little. They're talking about 50%. If we take into consideration from food production, so the changes in land use in order to produce, deforestation, or you were talking about the southern market and the Mercosur, Oscar, we see that all the time, the production of soy in Brazil, in Argentina, in Uruguay, and in Paraguay has completely changed the landscape of the pampas and the prairies. And now everything has been deforested and cut down in order to produce soy to be exported. So if you look at changes in land use, deforestation, transportation, we got this absurd system of global food supply that is not short chain at all. So it emits a lot in terms of oil production, of course, all the oil that you need in order for transportation to be made, all the packaging as well. It's more and more absurd what we see in terms of packaging, so much waste. And that's another section too, food waste. So if you start adding up changes in land use, deforestation, packaging, transportation, food waste, you can easily come up to 50%. And that's the problem of agriculture as it is right now, the problem of industrial agriculture. So we start seeing the interconnected nature of the crisis of food, agriculture, climate change, and health. And actually food and agriculture companies, some of the ones also was mentioned before, are among the worst performers in terms of their carbon footprint. So clearly what we're looking at now is that there are two futures for food and the climate crisis. And that depends a lot on what type of agriculture we choose to support. That's my dog, I'm sorry. That's my other dog, Chiqui. What type of agriculture we choose to support, defend, and advocate for. So I was talking before about regeneration and how this war is being co-opted quite a bit by these big companies. And I want to point out that regeneration is more than just a set of principles, of practices. If we look at that, that's a very reductionist view. In fact, thinking about regeneration in agriculture has to do with farming with nature and being part of nature. And there's about 3 principles that we always like to discuss or bring up, which have to do with this vision, this conception of agriculture, of regenerative agriculture versus conventional or industrial agriculture, which is what we're discussing today. One of these principles is the principle of diversity. In regenerative agriculture, we think that what is diverse is good. Nature thrives in diversity. Nature doesn't thrive in homogeneous monoculture landscapes and situations. And that thriving diversity is actually what makes nature adaptable and resilient. Actually, this is something we're looking at right now with the COVID-19. So this virus somehow has been a shock, and a lot of people have not been able to thrive, have not been able to be resilient, and that has to do also with the changes in our ecosystems, in our landscapes, and it's definitely linked to the loss of biodiversity that we've had in this type of agriculture that we've been practicing for the past 40 years or 50 years in some cases. So diversity versus homogeneity, diversity versus monoculture, and we got a choice here again, as we discussed before, is either we continue in this path of industrial agriculture by these 10 companies that creates extinction, that is moved by profit, or we move to a regenerative agriculture with principles of diversity that vets and encourages and promotes life. You mentioned, Oscar, the case of corn here in Mexico. That's a magnificent example of a center of origin. We got here 64 races of corn, well, here and in Central America, not just in Mexico, right? 59 are actually native to Mexico, and about 7 or 8 are native to Guatemala. But what we see too is that there's an invasion of GMO maize. And we've seen more and more how this is being brought here to Mexico and the consequences that it has on the landscapes, on life, on pollinators. So one of the principles, again, going back, diversity versus monoculture. Another interesting principle for regeneration is the idea of the law of return. And that has to do with farming with nature, what we were discussing a little bit earlier, is this idea of giving back. So it's not this vision that is a very stereotypical vision of industrial agriculture, which has to do with extraction. It's this idea of what I take, I must return. And even more, giving back. And this is important because it also is something that we see in circular economy. This whole concept of circular economy is exactly how it works in ecological systems. In ecological systems, what we do is we want to maintain the ecosystem through maintaining the nutrients that we give to the soil, the water cycles. And we see that in this economic paradigm, you were talking about this, Oscar, I agree with you as well, is this idea of a very linear way to look at life and at economy, in this case, at nature, this linear one-way extraction of resources and wealth from nature. And this, what it has done is what we've seen over and over again. It has somehow promoted systems of production and consumption that have torn apart these natural cycles of circularity. And we see it here in the ecosystems and the natural and social world, how is it distorting our social tissues, our nature, and our ecosystems. So somehow what we're seeing is that economy has put itself, or profit, this idea of profit, outside and above ecology. It's put itself at a different place. And what this has done is has disrupted the ecological systems and the processes that do support life. Everyone has talked about this, we've heard all this idea of the planetary boundaries, right? There are limits. Nothing is forever. There's certain planetary boundaries that should not be touched. And I think that the dominant economic system is definitely not taking into account the fact that resources are not infinite. There's finite resources. So for regenerative agriculture and for the regeneration movement, this idea of the law of return is very important. And another principle that is also very important is the principle of the commons. And that goes precisely against all of that Oscar was mentioning about these big companies that produce these GMO seeds with this whole chemical fertilizer package attached to that. And the idea of the commons is, okay, so the commons could be the seed, could be the land, could be the water, could be the air, the knowledge, the food, whatever nourishes us. We can even think about the commons as what we share in terms of democratic systems. Good, with its failings, with its good things. But the idea of reclaiming the commons for the regeneration movement is very important. It's an idea of what is common to all of us, opposed to this idea of privatization of the common good, which is what we've been seeing once and over again in this industrial agriculture model. And I want to point out also that what we've seen at the pandemic is farmers have become essential workers. They have become essential workers just as much as doctors. Again, what you eat is medicine. Food could be your medicine as well. So, and it is your medicine if it's real food, and not what they want to feed us, which is not real food. Food that nourishes, food that gives back, food that is full of nutrients, food that is full of life. Farmers are again essential workers in this pandemic, and yet they are the group that has suffered more the distress of the fluctuations of the prices of the economic market, of those twisted subsidies that Oscar was mentioning to agriculture. We see that in the suicide rates of farmers, not just in India. That's like that's a case that has been more emblematic and that everyone knows of, but that has happened all over the world because farmers are now dependent on these external inputs that they wouldn't necessarily need. But these 10 companies have made all their efforts to make sure that these farmers are in debt, that these farmers are dependent on them, and that these farmers also lose their land. And actually, there's this FAO. Everyone knows this figure, but I like sometimes to remember it and to bring it up. Is that 80% of the food that we eat comes from small farmers that use only 25% of the land and resources. So basically, then that leaves you with 20% of the land that is owned by big companies that do produce food that is not food because it doesn't nourish. And we are going actually in this whole concept of industrial agriculture to this absurd idea of farming without farmers. And this has to do with land grabbing from big corporations. This had to do with a bad use of technology. I'm not, of course, against technology, but a bad use of technology in industrial agriculture. And basically, it has to do also with this really distorted idea that social justice, workers' justice, well-being of farmers is not the most important part and a pillar of our livelihood, and a pillar for us to be able to actually thrive and be able to survive in pandemics like the COVID-19 pandemic, as we've seen. So when economics do work against ecology, the result of that is that our home suffers. And then again, what we're seeing today, climate crisis, water crisis, we see it here in San Miguel. I was telling Cliff, I came back yesterday to San Miguel and everything is so dry. And yes, we're in the semi-desert, but this drought is extreme. So the water crisis, the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the food crisis are somehow symptoms of this crisis of mismanagement of the earth and the resources. So I want to end soon because we want to leave some time for a Q&A. But in other words, what I want to convey, I guess, in this message is how we need to change or transition from a food system that we see now that is dominated by a focus on yields and calories. Again, not food, just yields and calories without taking into consideration the negative externalities of this food system, which we can discuss as well. A food system that is very reliant on chemical intensive agriculture, livestock production that is very concentrated. We see it with CAFOs and feedlots all the time. Ultra processed foods, which are really not food again. And then a very consolidated and yet deregulated global supply chain, which what it does is it exploits the workforce, the farmers. It has extractive land practices that basically undermine basic human rights, and they do undermine cultural traditions. So how we go from there, how do we go from there, how do we transition, and we need to transition from that to food systems that actually do focus on multiple benefits. These are the positive externalities, if you wish, of a good regenerative system that forms with nature. Health, resilience, inclusion, diversity, equity. So it all comes from all those three principles that we discussed before. Systems that do minimize greenhouse gas emissions. So it's no longer, 40, 50% of greenhouse gas emissions coming from agriculture. Systems that are focused on human rights, workers' rights, that actually we know, we recognize, and we encourage food production practices that what they do is they enhance the ecosystem health, they support shorter supply chains, and basically they assure that there's accessible nutrition, culturally respectful diets that do protect the planet, and not just food sustainability, but something very important that we always point out is not just being able to eat, but it's food sovereignty as well. So maybe we can discuss this more in the Q&A about, okay, so how do we actually transition? And there are certain ideas, but maybe Cliff, if you want to open the floor so we can actually have a discussion and more of a conversation. Thank you very much, by the way, for listening to me.
Thank you. We've just had two excellent presentations, very rich in ideas and opening up many questions I'm sure that people will want to discuss and ask about. Let me say a bit about how we will handle questions. There are some people who are viewing this on YouTube and they don't have any way of directly asking questions. So if you are on YouTube and have a question or comment, you need to send it as an email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. I will monitor that email account and pass questions on to our speakers. For those of you who are in our Zoom room, you can ask your questions directly, and I will put my screen on screen share so I can see everybody, and you will, and if you have a question, I will ask you to wave at me. You have to turn on your camera and wave. I'll call on you. You can unmute yourself and present your question and even dialogue with our speakers. So, who has the first question or comment they want to raise? While people are getting their thoughts together, let me just start it off with a question. And that is, here in San Miguel, of course, water has been a major concern for a long time with the current drought that is affecting most of Mexico. It's an even greater concern than normal. But it has always seemed very strange that in this high desert, semi-arid area of San Miguel, we are exporting our water to the United States in the form of broccoli and other off-season vegetables. And whenever I ask our local officials, why do you allow that to happen? Most of the water consumption here, groundwater consumption, is for agriculture, and that's mainly agribusiness. Well, the answer is, well, local officials don't have much control over it. It's national policy that has promoted export agriculture in Mexico. And so my question is, what can be done to change national policy? Anyone want to speak to that? Either of our speakers, or I see David Barkin has joined us. He may want to address that question as well.
Yeah, I mean, but the speakers have the main floor.
Right.
But I can say very briefly, the only way you can change that is having a representation, a political representation that will change that in Congress.
Mhm.
But here you have two problems, no? One problem is how economists have been trained over the past 40 years, and how economists look at balance of payments and these things. And they understand that it's correct to export broccoli, and they understand that the more you export food, the more income you have. And that ideology works together with the politics of it. And so what you see is that the different political parties come onto government and they don't do much of anything with the subject. They continue doing the same thing. But I have the impression they are pressed by the economics profession and what it says to be right, and not by common sense that it's not right. It just takes common sense. It doesn't take any curve. It just takes common sense. But unfortunately, common sense has been lost in economics, no? And I fear that here in Mexico it's even worse. Here you have a stronger influence of neoclassical economics and of the Austrian school, and it's very destructive, very destructive. But that has to do with politics.
Mhm.
The problem is that if the politics doesn't seem to be working from what I am seeing, from what I'm looking, from where I am sitting, it doesn't seem to be doing much of anything.
Yeah, and it would also be hard to have a political will. I mean, basically, what you want to do is you want to reform the agricultural subsidies and other fiscal incentives that we know now in Mexico where they go to.
Yeah.
Instead of supporting small farmers, supporting actually those who do produce our food, where do they go? They just there's all types of incentives for large scale agricultural production, like what we see right here. Should those guys be getting more money? Shouldn't we change the whole system of subsidies? But then you need someone with a political will to reform that. And that's very hard. But yes, you need representation in Congress, or you need a revolution.
Cliff, can I jump in here?
Yes, please. This is David Barkin.
Yeah.
Hola, Oscar.
Hola.
I would like to disagree slightly with Oscar. And I wonder what Ercilia means by revolution. In 2000, 12, Mexico reformed its constitution to create something called the human right to water. And in that constitutional reform, there was a clause which mandated a change in the national water law so that water would, the allocation of water would be reallocated, would be redirected towards solving human needs, urban needs, and social needs before industrial and agricultural needs. That legislation has been fully developed by something called the Iniciativa Ciudadana para una Nueva Ley del Agua, of which I have been working on for about 8 years. And it's been stalled in the Congress by politics, not by economics. But I think that it has to do also with the extraordinary influence of a small group of people. Ercilia in her talk, she was talking about 10 corporations. Well, we have in Mexico the group of people we call the Millonarios del Agua, the water millionaires. And we're not talking about millionaires in dollars, we're talking about it in terms of millionaires in terms of cubic meters of water that they control. In San Miguel in particular, your water problem has a name and a surname. Do you, Ercilia, can you name that person?
En el del productor de Kepa y los Rodríguez, yes. I got a blank now. But yes, I know who you're talking about.
His name is Usabiaga.
Usabiaga, ahí está, Usabiaga.
Yes. And I mean, he has a name and he has a surname. Now, it's really quite extraordinary. Usabiaga was Minister of Agriculture under which regime?
Vicente Fox.
What?
Fox.
Fox. And he controls water not only in San Miguel Allende, but in the whole state of Guanajuato. He single-handedly probably is responsible, might get me in trouble, is responsible for the arsenic poisoning of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people in the state of Guanajuato because of his overextension of the aquifer. So I don't think that it's a question, and that also has to do with the nature of what the National Water Commission, the CONAGUA, has worked. There's an attempt right now to change with the change in the leadership of CONAGUA, there's an attempt to confront this problem. So I would like to go to deeper. The problem of water, which has been very, very clear in this presentation, and the problem of the priorities, the economic priorities that Oscar is talking about are extraordinarily important, yes, but it has to do not only with agriculture, it not has to do with just the ideology of economics, but it has to do with the political power of the mining interests. In 2000, what year? 2013, the mining law was changed. And what does that mean? And that was part of the same kind of reforms that have led to the energy reforms. And it says that mining has a priority use for water over agriculture. That's extraordinary in this country. And the mining companies are controlled also by a small elite of people. I could go on, but I've already, the problem is not simply the economics profession where Oscar is firmly embedded in the UNAM in an environment and Oscar's participating in a very, very profound continental debate on what is the nature of economics. But the problem is much greater. It's not only neoliberalism, it's not only Austrian ideology, it's that those are used, and we have a central banking system here in Mexico, which reinforces that, no doubt about it. And that's what Oscar, I think, was referring to in his last comment.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the problem is far, far more serious. The problem is that it's not that just broccoli is more valuable than corn, as Ercilia was trying to say, or did say, but it's that profits are more important than people. And that has to do with the nature of the paradigm. And that's the struggle that we are going through in Mexico right now, that even within the present administration, there's a gigantic struggle going on about the way in which resources are going to be allocated. You people, you and San Miguel Allende, are victims, but are victims that I consider an unacceptable response by your local authorities that you reported, Cliff. A local authority that says, well, it has nothing to do with me. I have nothing to do with the allocation of water. That's just not true. We in Morelia, where I'm talking about, have cut off the water supply to some of the largest agro-industrial producers in order to assure adequate supplies in some of the more marginal areas. And right now, we're involved in another series of political battles against urbanization, the large real estate developers that are trying to cut down another group of trees, some of them for housing and some of them for avocados. So I think that the response of your, what was it, Presidente Municipal, Cliff? Is that who you were referring to?
Actually, I posed that question just yesterday to the head of ecology.
Well, the
And-
ecology is irrelevant.
And in the past, when I've asked that question, they have never pointed to national policy. But now that the local political leadership is under a different party than the national, they were quick to put the blame on national.
Well, but the ecology person is under the thumb of the
Of course, yeah.
Presidente Municipal. And so what, it would be very, very interesting that the Center for Global Justice started not being global and became local justice. And you convoke a seminar that you disseminate the way you're doing these, in which you have a discussion and a debate that confronts these people with the kind of resource allocation policies of your local government.
Maybe Ercilia wants to address some of these points.
Well, I was thinking about, well, I think that's actually brilliant to ask for transparency and accountability. That's always a good thing. No, I was thinking about how ironic it is, what David was pointing out, that Mexico has a great, one of the best, I've heard that, one of the best water regulations in the world from the 1917 Constitution. So, but the problem then again is it's a matter of enforcement. And it's as simple as, to me, it's that there's a lack of political will, there's a lack of enforcement. Everyone is kind of turning to the other side. It's not my responsibility. Same thing with Ecología here. But I mean, Ecología again is under the thumb. They have also no budget at all. There's not much they can do.
I think it's interesting that there are the power struggle between the 10 largest agribusiness firms and the controllers of water. I think that struggle between those two large major actors is what places the peasants. It places the peasants in a corner where they have no control over anything. Because they don't control the seeds, they don't control the water, they don't control the fungicides. I mean, they are the victims, if you will, of the of the general power structure. And that's something I hadn't thought about. I keep on thinking in economic terms, and that's wrong. No, that's wrong. That's one of the derivations of the profession. No, you end up looking at things in economic terms, and it's the politics of this that is so important. And right now, it's the local politics and the global politics, because this I find it ridiculous. I bought a piece of fish the other day. I couldn't find a huachinango in the supermarket, so I turned around. There was no fresh huachinango, so I grabbed frozen huachinango. I didn't read. I didn't anything. I just grabbed it, took it, brought it home, and my partner says, "What is this?" And I said, "Huachinango." And he said, "Do you think?" I said, "Well, it says huachinango, so no, this is not huachinango." We opened the package. No, this is not huachinango. And well, it was a frozen huachinango from Vietnam.
No kidding.
It tasted like cardboard. It cost like gold. It was a disaster. Now, what are we doing? And the problem is we have been untrained to look at the packet and see where the product comes from. We're not trained at doing that. We're trained at, oh, it's a pretty whatever. I want an apple. I grab an apple. That apple traveled 25,000 miles. It doesn't matter. And I remember when I was in Norway, the happiness when something arrived from Chile. Because it's 3/4 around the world for a plum. I mean, come on. that's a luxury. That's a luxury the ocean can't afford, and the air can't afford. But we have a problem of the power. It's a power problem and a consciousness problem. We have lost awareness of where things come from, and we have lost consciousness of distance and what that means in terms of energy, pollution. I remember when I was a child, distances were distances. I mean, you did not buy something from someplace else. Why? Because that was far away and it cost a lot of money. Today, it's far away, it's cheap. You buy it. And
it made sense actually to eat the produce that was in season, right?
yeah.
Winter time, you need vitamin C. You got tangerines, you got oranges.
Sí.
You know, it makes sense.
There was a cycle. There was a cycle. The spring, no, la comida de primavera, de verano, de otoño, de invierno. There was.
Claro.
We've lost that one. We lost that one.
Gregory Diamant, I think was trying to ask a question earlier. Let me call on you, Gregory.
With all of this interesting discussion, I won't say I forgot what I wanted to ask, but it has been pushed down. But there's so many interesting points here. I mean, first of all, I think the most cogent point is what David said, which is profits over people. And as long as that is what is driving things, you have a problem. All these other things that you talked about are kind of like the spokes of a wheel, but this was the center part of the wheel. You have the market distorting everything. What Oscar was just saying about, and Ercilia, about eating fruits from very far away and out of season and so forth. Well, it's part of the whole question of consumerism that we have been trained in, that we can get pretty much whatever we want as long as we have the cash with which to get it. And those are part of all the driving things. So, you know, David mentioned these laws which have been passed, or regulations which are not enforced, or some are still being talked about in the Congress. But unfortunately, I don't want to say I'm cynical, but I don't see things like that really getting enforced, because the power of money, the intellectual corruption, if not the physical corruption, is so great that it makes these things very difficult. On one hand, you talked about, I believe it was David who mentioned the mining industry getting a priority for water over agriculture. And you now have this government saying that they're going to open up coal mining again and produce coal plants, which of course we know is one of the dirtiest, most polluting things. And I don't know, I don't want to repeat what everybody knows. We want to get away from fossil fuels, not increase them. So therefore, water is going to go for mining coal, which the argument is it'll make 10,000 jobs. But what it will do to the environment, what it will do to the water table, and all of these things are not mentioned. Now, somebody has said, you know, we should put warnings on fossil fuels and all of this, as we did on cigarettes. You know, this is on the label on cigarettes where it says this is bad for your health, can cause lung cancer and all these other things. And every gas station and gas plant and coal mine and so forth should have one of those. But that's not going to solve the problem. But I just kind of like the idea of it, of pointing it out. But I think that's the thing, you know, profits over people is the central thing. The distortions that you have, the fetishism of the market, which distorts everything, the training that we've all gotten since, you know, in the last 50 years for sure, of, yeah, we can get pretty much whatever we want, and we don't see how we do it. And that all of nature is a free gift to capitalism, to production, which of course is ridiculous, because look at what it does to the metabolism of the world. And Oscar mentioned the fish from, you know, Vietnam coming here, but fish all over is becoming more and more of a rare commodity with overfishing and industrial fishing. You talked about industrial agriculture, but I think we need to mention the industrial fishing. They've just brought in California these industrial clam scoopers that destroy the whole bottom and pick up thousands of clams at one time. And what it's going to do to the clam population, one can only imagine. And you've got the industrial fishermen who are off the coast of Somalia and have been one of the reasons for the growth of piracy there. Because the people who used to be able to make a living off of fishing, the locals in their local boats, now can't do it anymore, because industrial fishing trawlers from Russia, from Europe, from the US, from all over are coming and taking their fish. So it is just a whole interrelated problem. And it comes down to that strive for profits, as which goes against, as Ercilia talked about, healthy eating and eating healthy food. It's very hard to have healthy food when profit motive is the driving force of the production of your food, whether it be fish or fruits and vegetables, meat, what have you, and what it does to water. So now I will shut up, but that is basically some of the things that I was thinking about when Cliff mentioned it.
Anybody want to take off on any of those points?
Well, the person who called themselves Center for Global Justice was trying to speak.
Liz, Liz Mestris, I think, was raising her hand. So let me call on you next. You have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I forgot to rename myself too. But anyway, yeah, had a question from way before. So I mean, to me, it's like when you're talking about changing the world's food system, which I think is more or less what we're talking about. It's like the first thing I think of is there's no one thing that does it. It's like very multifaceted strategy, right? And I was just, I mean, so here the local issues kind of come into play a lot, which I see here in San Miguel. In the US, you have the phenomena of community-supported agriculture, which I understand that Via Organica tried that a few years back, but I'm wondering if it's a time to try again, you know, because it's a more precarious time in a way, or more. But when Oscar was talking about agricultural futures, I mean, this is sort of like that. It's paying farmers in advance so that they can produce, so that you ensure you have healthy food. And the way I understand it is that it helps bring the price down, because it is, as it is now, organic produce is much more expensive generally than what you can get at the supermarket that's not healthy. And so how do we make healthy food affordable to regular people? And part of it is on, you know, I think we need strategies that do that, then those kind of have to be local. However, I just got an invitation to a world conference on localization. So it is a global movement. So, and it is a global problem. And I mean, for me, the issue of the legality of things is a matter of what kind of pressure you can put. You know, there's all kinds of laws that are ignored routinely, right? But including all over the US, it's not just Mexico, it's everywhere. I just heard that, and I read that in the case of the California forest, that indigenous tribes actually, by law, still have control over them, not the parks, but there's no recognition of that. I mean, but there is legally an argument, but so what, I mean, that might be of use, because now people are getting interested in how do you begin to get control over some of these things. I had one other thought, and that's why I'm trying to remember what it was. Yeah, but anyway, the question of making regenerative agriculture accessible, affordable, and is like, seems to me has to be done on a lot of levels. You know, subsidies would certainly help, but I wouldn't hold my breath. I mean, I remember one of the slogans of the Transition Towns movement is that if we wait on government, it'll be too little, too late. And so you have to figure out what can you do now, and that it has a back and forth relationship, I think. But yeah, I'll stop. I forget my question.
No, but I think that's, maybe just 1 minute, Liz, that's super interesting, the idea of the localization. And we saw an explosion of different efforts in Mexico, but in other places in the world, of CSAs, people starting to get organized, people starting to save seeds to create their own, you know, edible gardens. But I also think that that is connected to being able to get organic out of this niche, which is a very, you know, it's super expensive to eat organic. Not many people can actually afford that. It's not accessible. So how can we get organic out of that niche and make it more massive, right? And yes, and it's all connected. It's connected to subsidies. It's creating to incentives for small farmers. It's creating, you know, small markets like, you know, the Tosma.
Yeah.
Tons of Tosmas, right? Yeah, but that's super interesting. Yeah. Send me that email about the localization.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll do it now.
You know, we talk about profits over people, but actually what that boils down to is markets over people. And the ideology that has been used to legitimate the existing global markets comes out of the Austrian School of Economics that Oscar referred to, and is often known as neoliberalism. That says that okay, David, we'll come back to your veto of that point, but the point I want to make is that neoliberalism has claimed that regulation of markets, particularly at the national level, as Mexico used to do before NAFTA, regulation of markets distorts the markets and introduces inefficiencies. And so let the markets rule. The problem, however, is that politics intervenes, as this discussion has been pointing out.
Mhm.
The United States does not abide by its professed neoliberal principles. It subsidizes agriculture massively, while in the NAFTA agreement, forbidding Mexico from doing the same. And as a result, you get a terrible distortion of markets in the interest of the wealthy, in the interest of the countries of the global north, in the interest of the transnational corporations. As David Harvey has pointed out, neoliberalism really is about is a project for increasing the power, the economic and political power of capital. And that's why we end up then with markets over people. We did have, if there's no comment on that.
Cliff, I would like
yeah.
to add something, okay?
Yes, Roberto.
Well, I'm going to try to do an exercise of juggling with numbers and time, because accordingly, many statements have been said. We are facing a food market controlled by 10 corporations, which is ridiculous on the one hand. And on the other hand, when we think in terms of local measures, the first thing we see is that, well, if we talk with the municipal president, they've been in charge only 3 years. So in 3 years, what can be achieved in terms of 3 years? Very little. So this is the most visible things of the most visible aspects of things. But I think we are facing in this time, we're facing a revolution in terms, sometimes it is called the third or the fourth industrial revolution. And I think it's a matter of taking into account that sort of technology, because I'm thinking in terms of the platforms. The very big new corporations are working in the platform technologies in terms of energy, in terms of communications, and so on. So I think that we as people, we could take advantage of the platform technology in terms of the one of the main issues of one of the main advantages of working with platforms is that every single member of the society or the commune or the city could play his or her part in the whole platform. So I think we could those ideas, most of those ideas I have taken from a very peculiar case in India. In India, they developed a platform that they call societal platform thinking. Very interesting, because their basis for their proposal is that we're facing in this sort of social problems. We're facing a very huge sort of problems. Looks like they are always gonna be here because there's no way to solve apparently. But the response, the measures that has to be addressed must be in terms of huge, big scale. If you're facing social problems in big scale, the proposals has to be done in such terms, in terms of big scales. So, for instance, in India, they face the problem of how to provide terms of education for 200 students, 200 million persons. And how do you provide water supply for 100 million people more? So that sort of problems has to be dealt again with this new technology that is at hand, the platform technology, with the very main important aspect of this platform is the digital technology. If you, they have developed a very good technology base, which it is free. It's a free software that everyone can take and build upon this technology. And for instance, in India again, for the educational problem, for instance, they have 23 different languages for 200 million people. So, and they have progressed a lot. So I think it's a matter of studying what they are accomplished, what they are proposing, and to see what can we do with these measures. Okay, thank you.
Okay, we're running late on time, but I do have a question that has come in to our from our YouTube viewers. Doug Morris, I think that maybe he has left us by now, but let me put his question here up on the screen for you. Nevertheless, he asks, how might community organic gardens operate as a sphere of transformation away from capitalist agriculture in terms of transforming relations with nature, labor relations, administrative procedures, outlooks on governance, social relations, institutional arrangements, how we look at technology, approaches to daily life that might emphasize the common good, etc. This very much in line with what Celia was talking about earlier. So do either of you want to respond to Doug's question?
I just want to mention that when I was in Toronto several years ago, I saw this community garden in this, middle income, lots of migrants, as you know, Toronto is a very multi-ethnic city. So there were people from Armenia, Portugal, El Salvador, and each of them had a little, part of the garden. But the most beautiful thing about it is when it came to harvest time, they cooked their traditional dishes, their staple dishes. They made this big feast out in the community garden, and they started exchanging seeds. So for me, that was the most obvious representation of the importance of community gardens and culture and traditions and exchange. I just think that there's a way of interacting and relating to others through growing food, through growing things together, that is absolutely priceless. So I think that not only just community gardens, but also when children get educated in nature, when they say, okay, let's take the classroom outside and put it at a huerto, right, at a garden. Also, the way that kids learn through that experience is, it's great. So absolutely, community gardens do help to create bonds, and also you eat great. So 100% support that.
Community gardens not only grow food, but they grow community.
Exactly.
Well, we're running out of time, and so I think we need to bring this to a close. I want to thank our two speakers for presenting us with such a rich menu of ideas and insights. I enjoyed your presentations very much, and I'm sure that our viewers did likewise. I want to thank all of you who contributed to the discussion. Today's webinars, as well as past programs, are available on YouTube, accessible from our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. We have now 44 presentations there for you to review. I hope you'll join us again next Monday at this same time for a webinar with Rabbi Michael Lerner and Zavis, who will be talking about their book, Post-Socialism Vision, Revolutionary Love. Rabbi Michael Lerner is a well-known progressive rabbi, and I think you'll find him a very provocative speaker. Finally, thanks to our webinar team, Liz Mestris, Gregory Diamant, Roberto Robles, Olivia Canales, Bob Stone, and myself. And now this is Cliff Durand signing off until next Monday. Be well.
Thank you.